Hello, everybody. Welcome to the ASAP webinar series. We're really glad that you've joined us today. The webinar today is called Fraud Preventing, Detecting, Reporting, Investigating, and Managing Cases and Whistleblower Programs. So my name is Catherine Brokenshire Scott. I'm the project director for ASAP. And the webinar today will be presented by Doug Franke from Sustainability Solutions, and Damiano Kofa will be helping to answer questions by reading out your questions to be answered during this webinar. So I have a couple of ASAP notices for you. Thank you, Doug and Damiano, for sharing your screens right now. We will be using the Q&A from this webinar to document all of the questions. Please use the Q&A tab on your screen. We're able to retain all the questions if you write out your questions in the Q&A. If you write them in the chat, that's a different story. The chat disappears when the webinar is over. So please use the Q&A to ask your questions. We'll be launching a poll 30 minutes before the end of the webinar. We really appreciate your input. It helps us formulate the future webinars. As always, all of our webinars, presentation recordings, and Q&A are available at our website at intrahealth.org/ASAP resources. And today's webinar will be emailed to all of the attendees. And this webinar will also be presented in French on March 3rd. So if you have French-speaking colleagues, please let them know. Our upcoming webinars are in English are February 25th, that's tomorrow. We're having a webinar on gender equality, GBV prevention, and response services in USAID's PEPFAR programs. We already have a very high registration, and we're excited to share that presentation tomorrow. And then on March 25th, we're conducting a webinar on optimizing human resources for health staffing. And those webinars will be conducted in French as well. So I am going to hand this over to Doug Franke to start the presentation. Welcome, Doug, and thank you again for hosting this webinar.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. It's very exciting to have another shot at this fraud webinar. I think we've done one or two of these, and they were quite popular. And these have now been updated with the most recent rule changes that have taken place over the last few weeks. As we know, USAID updates its rules based on uniform guidance or other sorts of things. And these we try to always keep updating for you. So as Catherine said, this will be made available on their ASAP website. Fantastic IntraHealth, DAI, PACT, and some of the other fantastic NGOs that form that consortium. Okay, so a couple points. Every question is a good question. We love questions. There will be logical breaking points that I have here for everyone to, as Catherine says, put it in the Q&A. The chat disappears, whereas the Q&A remains. And if we don't answer anything in the seminar or the webinar, certainly we'll get it to you in writing after the fact. So I also see a hand raise. We will have sometimes we're going to have hand raises, and I think the moderator will be able to probably work with you in chat. But I see Abraham and some others have a hand up. Hopefully it's not your audio. Okay, so I'm just going to start in here. We have a lot of slides and never have enough time, but we will carry on. So as Catherine said, that's what it is about. A lot of information in here. You know, normally when we would do this beside ASAP, we include ethics and conflict of interest. And what you're going to see here, what I'm going to explain is truly, I think, conflict of interest goes it doesn't go hand in hand with fraud, but how you deal with conflict is similar to how you deal with fraud. And we'll talk about whistleblowing, and we'll talk about the systems. And the important point of this whole thing is communication between employer, employees. When they want to whistleblow and they want to communicate problems, you need a robust system that can go both ways. And some of the challenges of people's current whistleblowing system is they have a system that goes to some source and they never hear back, and they never know why something didn't get resolved that they thought should have been. And we'll talk a bit about that. And again, just so conflict of interest is hand in hand in terms of you can do so many things with a proper system. Okay, so what we have here is the ACFE, which is the sort of global association of fraud examiners. And, sort of how do we define fraud? I mean, many of us think we understand what fraud is and things. So I'm just going to go through a couple of points here. There is going to be, there's a couple of slide packs that I have available for you. It's most up-to-date ACFE packs. And I think I've got the PwC Global Crime and Fraud pack that certainly a lot of the slides you'll see in here came from there, and it's the most updated one. So if you want them, I'm happy to make those available to you as well. Okay, but conceptually here, I think the second definition of fraud is fraud includes intentional or deliberate acts to deprive another of money or something by unfair means. And I think, Catherine, the last time we had the USAID, when we did something like this for USAID, the question came up, afterwards, what happens if I didn't know, I was part of a fraud? And the whole point is, when we're going to talk about, notifying people, it's important whether it happened to you, or of course, if you're the perpetrator, you're probably not going to report it. But the important point here is always going to be about communication with your mission, with your prime, things like that. So we'll be going through those together. Okay. So now also in the uniform guidance, and if you've attended some of these webinars before, and if not, I highly recommend that you go back, and I'm just going to unvideo here because you don't need to see me. But the definition of fraud, this comes from the uniform guidance in the cost principles section, where they define fraud as this. And certainly, so this is, remember, the uniform guidance applies to USAID and every other federal agency. So it's a bit higher, but certainly USAID, through some of the things we're going to be looking at, goes on to provide a little bit more explanation of what to do if and when it happens to you. So, but the point here, yes, the same thing about fraud and corruption. And certainly this frequently can and does lead to debarment or suspension for the people or the implementing partners. But the important point here is this False Claims Act, okay? And so for non-US NGOs, and I'm assuming, let's just do a quick hands up here. What I'd like to do, and Jeff can help me monitor, but let's go to for everyone, could everyone who can put their hands up, please do so right now. So I have a frame or a base to see, just so find in your thing. Okay, about 2 hands up, 3, 5, 7, okay, 13. So everyone who can, I'm going to have a couple times you're going to need a hands up because we're going to do some like quizzes for you. So I'd like to see a few more because I've only got maybe a 6th or 8th of who is on here. Okay, all right. Well, that's about only actually about a 5th. Okay. Okay, well, thank you, and I'll appreciate when you put your hands up and down later. But so what I'd like to know is who on this course or webinar is a foreign-based NGO, meaning a non-US. So you're African, or you're somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere else. I see some, looks like names from Asia. We could just see the hands up for those who are sort of participating from a non-US NGO. Okay. Okay, so it's around 40, and I think it may be more. Some people maybe just haven't found the button there. Okay, well, thank you for that. So it's interesting that the False Claims Act, many people don't realize that, this is a very serious act, and through the uniform guidance, it should affect everyone in terms of what this means. And a false claim is where someone who certifies that a submission is correct to your controller's office or OFM, they certify that this is that everything on this claim is valid. not realizing that, a false timesheet, a false procurement activity, a false person, those are false claims, and those can cause serious trouble. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to highlight is, people may want to go and understand and talk to your mission about what this means for you in your country, because that's quite, you don't want to have a False Claims Act against your organization, or certainly you individually. Okay. I mean, a lot of times these webinars are a lot of fun, and fraud, unfortunately, isn't the most fun discussion, but it's incredibly important. So, yeah, but again, great Q&A I hope we have coming up. Okay, so remember the 2 CFR 200-113 is where it would be in the uniform guidance. And as in our other webinars, we explained that USAID has incorporated many of the uniform guidance items in their mandatory standard provisions, or the provisions that are going to be attached to your award. There's standard provisions and required as applicable. So at N26, this is where it explains that you must disclose on a timely basis. And I'll show this again, the USAID specific rule, M26. But 113 says, look, if there's fraud, you've got to notify USAID. We'll talk the difference between USAID money and non-USAID money. But the bottom line is you must report fraud. And I'll be absolutely honest, fraud happens all the time. So, don't be afraid. It's unfortunate if it happens, but I'm saying if it happens, the worst thing you can do is try to hide it, because eventually the truth comes out. And, it's unfortunate if you don't disclose, as it says here, the remedies as described in 339, which is remedies for noncompliance, can be severe. I mean, suspension, debarment is not what you want. And so I would say, we can talk about when you do it. Maybe Q&A, you're going to ask, I think there might be a problem. Well, I think it needs to get to a certain level of gravity that you believe it is true, or it could be some basis of the fraud or the whistleblowing. And certainly from my point of view, I would get that over to probably your agreement officer soon, but we'll talk about that. Okay. So again, mandatory standard provision 12. And this one is important, even if it's not USAID money. And I hate, simply talking about rules, and it's horrible when you start a webinar talking about rules, but there are so many important rules about fraud. And the important point here, it could be Global Fund, Gates Foundation, EU, DFID money. It doesn't matter. The whole point, if there's fraud on your project, and it goes on to say that if any of its principles, so please go into the provision 12C, that's ADS 303 MAB for all of you. And if you don't have that, I'm happy to send it to you, but I think it'll be on the ASAP website anyways, or you can find it at usaid.gov. Search engine's top right, just type in ADS 303 MAB, and you'll get the most updated version as of 2 weeks ago. Okay, so the whole point is that if there's fraud, the U.S. government wants to know about it. Okay, and so the bottom line though is rarely are you going to know if your people, no one's going to join and say I'm dishonest, I'm an embezzler, I forge, I bribe people. So it could happen that you find out during the award or even after the fact that you immediately learn something bad happened. You have to notify your agreement officer. Okay. Now it's a different rule if it's USAID money. You have to notify the agreement officer or the OIG in Washington. But we'll see that. Okay. So you can't say, oh, it's Global Fund money, therefore I don't have to report that. No, you do. And because frequently, we've worked with many organizations that this happens to, and the first thing USAID is going to want to know is did it happen to our money? Could it happen to our money? And what controls are you going to put in place to make sure this doesn't happen with anyone's money in the future? Okay, so it's all about fixing your internal controls. And at the end of this, if we have time, we'll talk a bit about internal controls and that's really how one prevents fraud, is by improving your internal control framework. Okay, here's another one. So this one, M24B, is recipients can't require employees to sign confidentiality agreements, which basically tries to stop people from whistleblowing. Okay, so I mean, we're auditors, Sustainability Solutions, and we look for this by talking to people, asking people, have you been required to sign anything? And the bottom line is, if the employer is forcing people to be confidential, that's not good. Okay, because then it's trying to coerce people to not, obviously not whistleblow. Okay, so here's M26 that I mentioned, and so there's a difference between the prime and the sublevel. I mean, generally, USAID has a relationship with the prime and not necessarily with the sub, except in this case. And it's not really a relationship, it's just a notice. So what happens is if there is fraud with USAID money at the prime level, the prime recipient, you must notify the OIG in Washington, not the RIG. You notify the IG in Washington and certainly notify your AO, the one who granted you the funds, of whatever happened. Okay, at the sub level. Okay, remember, subs normally didn't have a relationship with USAID. Well, what happens is here, now the sub must notify their prime, so the AO equivalent who gave them the funds, and they must notify the IG in Washington, okay? So just be aware of that. So now there is sort of a, not relationship per se, but there is at least a requirement to notify this. And one more time, if you don't notify, there could be problems. And I don't blame them. I mean, USAID gives you the money to spend it correctly, and so please do so. But do note, there is frequently fraud, and we're going to all do our best to prevent it. But if it does happen, don't try to hide it. Okay, a couple quick surveys here, and I said these surveys will be available to you after the fact. But fraud happens everywhere. The most recent PwC survey, and normally these came out before Davos, so I didn't have one this year, I don't believe. But the bottom line is, over the past 20 years, crime is rampant and fraud is rampant. And it's not just, Africa, North America, it's everywhere. North America is almost the size of Africa, and so forth. Okay, so these are reported crimes or frauds. Now, the reality is, many people don't report their frauds. So it is probably actually quite higher than this, okay? So it is quite high. And when I attended the U.S. Government Audit Quality Center, we had a continuing education course a while back, and they were saying, wait until COVID audits start. And certainly, we're in that phase now, and, one's gonna wonder, how am I going to justify my timesheets? How am I going to justify my this and that and that? So I think we'll be watching this space quite closely on COVID auditing. Okay, again, one more time, where are the countries? Well, they're everywhere. It's not just Africa or whatever else, or Asia or Latin America. You'll see across the board a lot of countries everywhere in the world: India, China, South Africa, U.S. Ireland and France at the bottom there, but still, everyone experiences fraud. So, and we're going to see it's big businesses, small businesses, NGOs, for-profits, everyone has fraud. We just have to do our best to present it. So I tried to hone this into situations where fraud in nonprofits, because most of the recipients, implementing partners, are nonprofits. And there's no doubt, and we'll see this again, is that we just don't have the funding necessarily to always have proper internal controls in place. Many times you're an NGO and you're going to do your proposal and you're thinking, oh my God, well, we can't afford an internal audit department. We can't afford an internal control review. We can't afford a risk review. Well, think about it. We're going to be talking here about when a risk review gets done on you, and basically the first domain that we do under a NUPIS is the organization. Do they have proper controls in place? And out of the 6 non-U.S. pre-award survey domains, very very importantly in the organization and in the financial management area, one is meant to have internal controls. So that's why we're going to come back to the importance of internal controls. Yeah, I think even though I have few slides in here due to the time, I think it's worth going through all of these slides from both of the ACFE and PwC to see just the different ways to look at fraud and crime. Okay, so who perpetrates the fraud? Okay, well, frequently it depends, and the size of the fraud very much goes along with who perpetrated it. So when it's management and the leaders, they tend to have much larger frauds than the middle management and then and the employees, which is normally theft. employees, people stealing something or other. And, of course, it's hard to stop, but there are controls for that. But of course, if the owners get involved and the auditors and the board, that's where your mega frauds take place. And this, this is fraud in nonprofits. When you look at the fraud in just on average, they're 3 times as high. Okay, it's obviously there's only so much money in nonprofits. You're not the bank. Okay, so I'm going to stop here quickly to make sure if anyone has Q&A and wants to talk about anything. So I'll turn it over to our moderator. Any questions? I see some hands raised.
Yeah, I don't have questions in the Q&A box.
Okay, well, everyone, just please be aware there'll be 3 or 4 more of those opportunities. So yeah, maybe we haven't dug deep in enough. Okay, so let's jump into the types of fraud, and we're going to focus pretty much on fraud by employees, because that is where, again, we could talk about external fraud and customers and vendors and things, but it's normally internal crime that we have control over more than possibly external. So this is called occupational fraud. Okay, using your occupation for personal enrichment through, again, deliberate, remember, fraud is deliberate misuse or misallocation of funds. And there's a simply stated, an employee basically rips off his or her organization. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, external fraud, I just highlight a couple things here because, again, we don't have time, but the falsified account information, we're seeing frequently that where people are receiving emails saying, oh, change our banking details. And so, many times, people put at the bottom of their emails now, we will never change our banking details. We'll work with you and all these things. Also, intellectual property. We see right now all these hacks and thefts and cloud bursts and IP hacking. So, there are ways of that, but that's not really the focus of what we're looking at today. We're looking at internal fraud. Okay, so what can influence fraud? Well, very much, what business if you're in. If you are into, brick making, it's pretty hard to, steal bricks. If you're into, IP and small things that are high value, well, there's certainly a lot of greater chance for, those things to walk out the door, or if they're digital assets, again, to be hacked. So, again, internal controls, we'll keep coming back to this. The importance of internal controls reduces the opportunity for fraud. And we'll see this 3 or 4 times. And then finally, the ethics and value of the company. We'll hear the concept of tone at the top, which is, the very first concept and principle of proper controls. If the leadership believes their own, believes and walks the talk, and that hopefully they will also identify employees who are honest, and they will attract employees who are honest. So those are some of the factors we will be looking at. Okay, most people hopefully have heard of the fraud risk triangle, and it's quite interesting. We're doing research that it was developed by a criminologist, not a fraud person per se, but a person who studied crime. And the concept is, this is what it looks like. It is pressure at the top, opportunity on a corner, and rationalization on another corner. And the concept here is that if one of these exists, it may not result in a fraud. But if 2 or 3 exist, there's a very good chance there would be fraud. Okay, so we start with pressure or incentive. And the concept here is that someone, and this is where under COVID, again, this could be very, it could be more common. And so it could come either from a financial situation. Your spouse lost their job, you've lost your job. Maybe there's an illness in the family, COVID. You need to, in many countries, it's not as good as states or other places. You have to go buy your own oxygen or whatever else. So there could be significant financial need. But the second one is more gratification. This is why criminologists, highlighted this. Many times people just enjoy fraud and stealing. How often do you hear, in Hollywood that, someone, actress gets caught with a $50 something stealing from a store, and you think, you could have bought the store. Why do you do it? Well, it's because, they got away with it the first time and they may want to do it again. So when we talk about how to reduce pressure and reduce these three things, let's just think about, both. It's not only necessarily financial, it could just be that person is wired that way. Okay, next is the opportunity to commit the fraud and have it not be detected. And this is all about controls and mechanisms in place. Why do we have timekeeping? Why do we have password changes? Why do we have bank reconciliations? Why do we have locks on our doors? Why do we, all these things are the controls in place. If they're not in place, there will be fraud. And you'll see this is the highest percentage. So here, the other point is when you talk about collusion. So people, or people with authority who manage many people can say, oh, please do this, Joe's not here today, can you do this? And they can basically override the system. So certainly you need to look for this as well. And the problem is for many NGOs who are smaller, you won't have an internal audit function. You just aren't going to have the money for it. You might, again, it never hurts to put that in your budget and your proposal and explain why you need it. But sometimes there just may not be the funds. Okay, so that means management has to get involved. That's where the importance of strong management and honest management. And finally, the rationalization is the justification of it. Okay, so everyone else is stealing, it's my turn. Okay, no, I know these other guys are stealing, therefore it must be okay, or no one cares, or whatever. Okay, which is of course not true. But that's, again, the importance of a whistleblowing system, the importance of internal controls, all these things lead to the reduction of that. So even if there's an opportunity and there's no pressure, and the guy can't rationalize it. He says, well, no, I'm not wired that way. It's not the right thing to do. I don't believe in that. I don't need the money. Yes, I know there's a hole in the system, but I'm not going to try to rip it off. Okay. But if you've got the hole in the system and pressure to come up with money for your dying spouse, that's when fraud happens. Okay, so this tool can be used, think about it, of different ways to knowing what that pressure, knowing that rationalization, knowing that poor controls exists. You should consider using this. And I just wanted to show the last time PwC put out their survey with this, what it said is 59% of the fraud happened because the opportunity existed. And that's what we have to fix, okay? That's what we all have to look at here. Okay, 21% was incentive, but as I said, under the Government Audit Quality Center, they thought that would spike, just like COVID spiked, hopefully. This pressure is going to be higher now because of course, many Main Street people, not, many of the normal mom and pop shops or NGOs could be hurting. Only 11% was the rationalization. Okay, I think there are a few questions, so I will turn it over to our moderator, please.
Yes, now I have a few questions. Let me start from the beginning. There is a question that says, could you please explain what cash larceny is?
Larceny, I think, that's just another form of theft. Cash larceny is when someone steals cash, I believe. And it wasn't part of the presentation, but that's my understanding of larceny is theft of cash. Okay. Cash larceny would be cash theft.
All right. Yeah, the next question I have is, at what point do you confirm fraud before reporting it to authorities?
Okay, a good question. So I think people, if they whistleblow, certainly that's quite important, depending how you hear about it. So an organization, we're working with an organization that had a whistleblowing complaint come in. Management looked at it. Now it went, again, whistleblowing is important who it goes to. Hopefully it goes above it goes to the board level, because the board should be independent, and the non-executive directors who should be managing them. But if you have an internal audit function, they normally report, and I'm going to show this, to the board and to management. So depending on where the fraud was, it might go still inside the company and maybe copied. So, but when do you report it? So I think it's when an assertion comes in that they think there's fraud, and management or the board looks into it and says there could be something here. So at that point, I think you send a note to, again, depending if you're prime or sub, but let's say you're a prime, you send it to your AO saying, dear AO, this happened, here's what happened, and here's what we're going to do about it, with a copy to the IG in Washington. Okay? And normally they'll say, great, keep us informed. Now, if it's something potentially really serious, they may ask OIG investigations to get involved. Okay, but that very much depends on the size and scope and whatever. So But again, certainly, I think as soon as you think there could be some substance here, I would say report it. You could be wrong, and later on you say false alarm, but I think the mission's still going to want to follow up and see what happened. Good?
Okay. I have a related question also asking about a specific fraud act that is supposed to be followed to report to the agreement officers. Do we have a specific fraud act that we need to refer to when reporting to the agreement officers?
Okay, so each country may have their own rules and regulations on fraud and who one reports it to. Certainly in South Africa, where we are based, if crime is greater than a certain level, one is meant to notify the police. For the audit firms, if crime is identified at your audit client, you are meant to report that to the auditing authority, not to the police. So it very much depends on the act of your country. Okay, a couple points though, and it's quite interesting. Okay, this is not an auditor training course, but under generally accepted government auditing standards or the Yellow Book, it's quite important they say, look, you have to be cognizant of the rules in each country, auditors, and you don't want to upset you certainly want to follow the US government rules, but you also must be aware of the local country rules, okay? So I think it's important to say, okay, what are the rules in my country? Kenya, Ethiopia, whatever else, Nigeria, and be aware and follow those rules. So again, it would very much depend on each country.
All right. Another one is to do with the investigation. The question is, can you start the investigation before reporting fraud?
Yeah, I think absolutely you would. I think you want to make sure it's real. We had a situation. That's why I say it's important to have this open communication, if you can, because a lot of times people are just so afraid to report it, and that they're going to be found out who they are. So the importance of a reporting system that can remain anonymous. But we were helping an organization that had a whistleblowing that said they had 13 different assertions or claims that these were fraud. And we helped them with the investigation, and we found that only 3 of them had merit. The other 10 were without any merit whatsoever. Now the problem was that person, and a lot of times there isn't always enough information to go further, to say, geez, it would be better if you could given us an invoice or a date or a person or something else to follow up. So that's part of the problem. But certainly, I don't think I would report everything to the mission right away. You want to make sure there's some substance to it. Because frequently, and another thing, people don't realize when we talk about whistleblowing, and it comes later, whistleblowing is fairly serious stuff. It's gross waste mismanagement, gross misuse of things, gross danger to the public, and abuse, which in itself is gross anyways, using your position for helping yourself. So, if it's an HR issue, that's not whistleblowing. That isn't necessarily fraud. That's reportable. So make sure you're reporting the right thing to USAID. And if you're not sure, ask your AO. Maybe get some examples. Also, frequently ACIP has. I think we had Aaron Rodgers do a presentation a while back, and ask the IG. The IG investigation is frequently willing to do presentations. Okay, good question. Okay.
Yeah, of course, there's a follow-on question that says, is the investigation not a police work?
Okay.
At what point do we hand over to the police without, disrupting the process or disreputing the organizational image?
Okay, so I don't think investigating a fraud is necessarily police work. Obviously, when I say investigate, meaning determine whether there's validity to the claim that there was fraud. So yes, we had a situation where it would appear that people were submitting false monitoring and evaluation reports and inflating their results. Okay, so in theory, so now you go back to see the data cleansers, the data capturers, whatever, and was there a collusion here that something false was given to the U.S. government? Okay, now that sort of thing may never get to the police, but certainly that's fraud. If you're saying we've got 10,000 people in care and treatment and there's only 5, I mean, are the police even going to want to know about that? So no, you're going to investigate that. You're going to say, yes, this is fraud, USAID, reporting it. Now, again, depending on your country, that may or may not be something that has to go to the police. And again, it would be country specific. Good question.
Another one is to do with the size of organizations. There are some institutions that are small, and when their fraud is reported, it's easy to identify or know who has reported the fraud. So the question is, what do you recommend?
Okay. I'm going to close the window because it's raining like crazy here. Just 1 second so I can hear you better. Never complain about rain in Africa, but okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Now, the question is about the organizations which are small. You know, when the fraud is being reported, it's easy to identify and know somebody who has reported. So the question is, what do you recommend? How should this be reported to avoid suspicions and knowing who has reported the fraud? Yeah,
that's a very good question. And the small organizations, only one person, he or she may know, something. But the bottom line is fraud's a fraud, and that's why it's so important. There are anonymous ways to report, and and the reality is you have to deal with it. Management must be decisive. They must be clear. We'll talk about it in a few more slides. But a proper whistleblowing system is able to receive things anonymously, deal with them anonymously. And, unfortunately, if it is what it is, a small organization, but that's where hopefully you can report to a board member. I mean, if you're concerned at all about management, and we just had one about eight months ago, an organization, it was their chief of party who was part of the fraud. Okay, so it doesn't do any good to report up the food chain if the person at the top is the one who perpetrated the fraud. So generally it should go outside to the person who you should probably trust most would be the board chairperson or the chair of the audit committee. Those will be non-executive directors. They'll be independent, and it is their job to deal with it. Okay, but again, a small organization, that's the problem. There's only so many people who could report it. Okay. Next question.
All right. Next question is to do with the sample size. It says when fraud case is reported, how do you determine the size of sample size to be investigated? If, for example, it's 20 million worth, do you investigate the whole 20 million? Do you investigate 1 million, or do you investigate something substantial just to help you report? What's the size of the investigation volume?
Okay, so a good question. I think the concept of size comes in after you determine that there was any fraud. Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, but basically what you're probably going to find is a hole in the internal control system. Someone was there's an opportunity to commit the fraud. The size of it, I mean, it doesn't matter. I'm not saying, 1 million or $20 million, 1 million is still absolutely material. And notice the US government rule says any fraud. So because the whole point is a fraud, and if you don't sort it out, it could become a bigger fraud next time. As we saw, pressure may be the ability to commit a second fraud and a third and so forth. So I don't think you can, look at it in terms of materiality of investigating. When you see that there is a hole in the system and we lost anything, that's time to, you may, at that point, I would say, okay, AO, dear OIG, here's what we found. We're going to continue to investigate. We're just putting you on notice that that something has happened, and we're going to continue to investigate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think we can proceed, Doug.
Okay. Yeah. Keep them for now, and that's fantastic. We'll continue carry on here. Go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to stop the video here. Okay, so fraud management is a process that takes place in the same structure as the internal control, what we're going to call the Green Book, the internal control framework. It's the global framework that the U.S. government has borrowed or has agreed to follow on. And so I'm going to show you in a little bit some of the tools that one uses. But all of these activities, okay, this it's called the COSO framework, and it's a framework that works perfectly well for an NGO, for Microsoft, for a hospital, for an opera, for a zoo. It doesn't matter. For-profit, not for government agencies. Okay, the U.S. government itself essentially uses this format. Okay, and it is, the governance is starting at the top, and then you perform your assessments. Okay, and then basically, your control activities. We're going to talk about prevention and detection. Okay, and then we'll talk about, what to do, how do we investigate, and the corrective actions you should take. Okay, and then of course the system has to monitor itself to make it work. So really it all starts at the tone at the top, and I think that's what my next slide is. Yes, management role and fraud prevention. And this is the same thing, as I said, when you're doing your pre-award surveys, that's where you start. Is management there? Do we have controls in place? Do they, again, it's not just financial controls. Okay, we're also going to talk about, ethical behavior and things like that. That's why ethics, conflict of interest, and fraud are such good topics to talk about together. Okay, but you're going to see throughout here, it's always going to talk about controls. Okay, segregation of duties, how we hire and get the right people in. That's all management's role to put in place a proper system. Okay, so then there are the fraud risk assessments. So assuming management has something in place, then we need to do a risk assessment to realize, what are the risks of our organization of not achieving our objectives. So there's a whole process, and frequently NGOs every year, and certainly, most organizations will have some sort of a strategy meeting where they might perform a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. But this risk assessment is a specific, and I'm going to show you some examples, a specific task that one does to determine, what's going to stop us from achieving our goals. And fraud is one of those things. Okay. So this is what the risk register looks like. Okay. And this is not anything, again, most of your auditing firms will have this. Every internal audit group will have this, and I've broken this into a bigger slide to show you what they are. And I do have some examples, possibly if we have time. I'm just a bit concerned on time, but I had my team put together 5 examples. We'll do at least one. Okay, so let's just get into a bigger description. So this is what happens when internal audit or management will come, or this could be outsourced to consultants as well. But it's better if the organizations, they must participate because it's their risks and they know how their operations work. You might have a consultant or internal audit outsource your internal audit, and they'll drive you through the process. But the concept is your job is to identify the risks. So, you're going to find the description of the risk and why it is a risk and what controls are currently in place to stop that risk. And then, the likelihood of that risk going to happen. And the likelihood will be anywhere from basically 1 to 4. And I'll show you how this gets rated. Okay. And then the risk impact. The impact will be rated from 1 to 5. And then that gets a score. You multiply this one by this one and you'll get a risk score. And then you go on to say, okay, whose responsibility is it to deal with this risk? Who's the owner of the risk? Okay, and then if there are further actions that could be taken, which means more controls put in place, what would they be? And then if we're going to do that, what are we going to do? And then again, it's someone's responsibility. It's not always the one person's responsibility of internal audit. He or she drives the process, identifies the owners of the action, and then again, classic, when are we going to get it done by? You keep looking at this every so often, certainly at least every quarter, but maybe monthly. And then again, when are we next going to look at this issue? Because some internal controls never, or weaknesses never get addressed because they're not a priority or there's no money and that kind of stuff. Okay. So what would happen is you would do all those, what I just said, and then you'd plot those risks onto what we call a heat map. Okay. As we said, the impact is, the impact that's going to have on our organization. Well, of course, the higher you go, and then the likelihood that it's going to happen. So is someone going to get COVID in our organization? Likelihood is high. What's the impact? Well, one person with COVID it's horrible for that person, but for the organization of a whole, it's not too high. So you could have, very, very high here and very low here. And so, the whole point is the things that are high risk, high likelihood, that's what you focus on. So basically what this does is it brings focus. Okay, so I'm just going to unshare that for a second. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to reshare for you what I had my team put up. Let me just show all windows here. Okay, so here is, I'm going to go back to sharing now. Share screen. Okay, did that pop up? It's now a risk ID. Someone put your hand up if you've got a picture of a yellow and blue. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so let's just take an example here of The first risk here, classic, fraudulent supporting documents for travel claims. Okay. Now, why do we have fraudulent travel claims? Well, employees make their own travel arrangements, so they have a lot of control over where they stay and what they do and that sort of thing. And so a normal key control would be, oh, well, we've got a policy for that, a travel policy. No, but is it adequate? Is it adequate that that's going to work? And so, what's the likelihood? Now, the likelihood of something happening is sometimes based on, has it happened in the past? Or it's a sort of a risk assessment. I don't want to get too deep into it, but if it's happened in the past or you're aware of it happening in other organizations like yours, it's more likely. Okay, and they normally say from 0 to 2 years, 2 to 5, 6 to 10, and more, when the last time this fraud took place. So that's that. Now, what's the impact of fraudulent travel? Well, financially, it's not that great. Normally, this is a percentage of your organization's revenue or turnover. Okay, so you multiply that by each other, and this one gets an 8. Okay, that's the overall risk. So it could be as high as 5 times 4, 20, and this is an 8. Okay, so whose job is it to deal with this? The risk owner is the admin manager. She or he's dealing with travel, and it's pretty much their responsibility. So can we do something more? Can we have more controls over it? Well, yes, we can. Of course, we can have more controls over it. What can we do? We can have, I'm going to move this over a little bit. Hopefully it's moving over on your screen. So basically, we can let the organization perform the bookings, take control of it. Better control the per diem rates. Are we on an actual basis, or are we going to go now maybe on a you don't need receipts and things like that to deal with it, but you can normally increase the controls, and then you give it to whoever's job it is and monitor it on a regular basis. So that's just one example of where you could do it. Let's just do the next one just to give you the concept here. Receiving kickbacks from suppliers. Well, of course, procurement is always fraught with, unfortunately, with fraud, because money changes place, and you're getting goods and services for friends, whatever. And so, normally, we have normal controls, procurement, conflict of interest declarations, gift policy, registers, all this stuff. But certainly, the risks are, in this case, we assessed it would be a 3 and a 4. So again, it's a high. The 3 would be the likelihood it's going to happen because maybe it's happened in the past. Or a 4 would be, again, how impact. And again, money, it's more likely to have a large procurement can have serious money. Okay, so what do we have to do? We've got controls in place. We can add more controls, possibly annual lifestyle for procurement people. The guy shows up normally in a Datsun or a Toyota, and next thing you know, they're driving a Merc or a Mercedes or a Land Cruiser. How did they get that money? Okay, so those are the sorts of things you can do to protect. And I don't have more time, but I'd be happy to talk about this at any time. Okay, so that's an example of a risk register. And what that does, I'm going to stop sharing and get back to what we had before, our screen. Okay, back to share. And so you plot those out on your risk map, and then you focus on the the higher ones, the ones that are 14 to 20, work their way up here. Okay. So again, there could be a lot of questions there. And internal controls are always fun, but we don't have a lot of time in this webinar. Okay, so we're going to talk about control activities. How do we reduce or mitigate risk? Okay, and there's processes that could be preventive or detective. Those are the 2 types of things. You can prevent it from happening, or you detect it after the fact. And again, you guys are going to get these slides, so I'm not going to read the slides to you. That's not my job. Your job is to hopefully read the slides later if something really perks your interest. Okay, so there's different types of controls, preventive or detective, and they can certainly be manual, like locks, and they could be computer automated, like controls over your password and things like that. Or completely automated, where there are intelligence systems that are observing and doing all kinds of data things on a real-time basis. Okay, generally people say preventive mechanisms slow systems down. Okay, so that could be true because you're trying to prevent the crime from happening before it takes place. So generally it will be it could slow things down because you're not letting processes take place until certain hoops are jumped through. Okay, now fraud, people don't, it's been proven, reputational risk okay, is real, and organizations that have had frauds, and they're, if unfortunately, if it's been with management or leadership or other sorts of things, it hurts the reputation of that organization. And frequently, if it's a public company, you're going to lose your your clientele and your trust factor. And if it's an NGO, as we saw with Oxfam in Haiti, you're going to lose, your donations and many of your funders. Okay. So let's just talk about a couple here. I've created some things for you. So prevention, as we said, is we have policies and procedures and awareness to reduce fraud. But you're never going to stop at 100%. It's impossible, okay? Because someone always has a new mousetrap or a new idea of how to steal. Okay, so as we said before, I showed you this before, so it's management's job to put in place a structure that is going to have the proper controls with the proper people, but also that you have identified your risks. Okay, so the risks for someone doing ART is different from someone who's doing economic development or Feed the Future or some of the sort of voter registration, some of these things. Okay, the frauds are very different depending on what the what we're trying to achieve. So we have to know our objectives and then figure out what's going to happen. Okay, so I want to show here just a couple more quick slides here. This might be tough for you to read, but that's why I'm making these packs available to you. And again, I do recommend it because it's an eye opener. But the bottom is that small businesses, because they don't have controls, don't have necessarily audited external. If you can see it, the blue is what the smaller organizations are, which would go hand in hand with NGOs, and the green is the larger employees. So again, external audit financial statements. Well, that costs, and maybe NGOs don't have to do it. Okay, important other ones. Management certification of financial statements. 39% for small organizations, 85% for large. Get management involved in the financial management of the organization. That's their job. How do we have controls without management getting involved? You're going to see this is one of the top 3 reasons, because management isn't doing their job. Again, management review. Only 35% for small businesses, 76% for large, and so forth. Okay, external audit. Okay, 33 and 80. So again, I'm not saying there's not fraud in large businesses, but these very important things: hotlines, audit committees, okay, employee support systems. All these things are not. Many of these are not expensive. Okay, many of these, having a hotline is not expensive. Fraud training for employees is not expensive. Anti-fraud policy, not expensive. It takes management to put these things in place and be willing to follow up. So as we said, fraud controls in the not-for-profit sector, 35% of it is because they don't have proper controls. 19, no management review, or 14, which is where management overrides, meaning they can force people to do what they want them to do. But again, if they're good management, as I say, if you've got a board and any sort of internal control framework, that shouldn't happen. Okay, so we've got detection and we've got prevention. As I said, detection normally takes place after the fact, and so we're going to talk about some of these. I'm just cognizant of time here, so let's just get to some of the examples here. So detection after the fact, and I'm going to talk about this some. We're going to talk about tips or complaints. This is very much part of a whistleblowing or communication system. Now, whistleblowing, is defined specifically, from the U.S. government point of view as something very, very significant, but the same controls can be in place even if it's not formal whistleblowing. It is reporting wrongdoing, could be ethical bad behavior, could be reporting conflicts of interest and other things that don't rise to the level of whistleblowing. Okay, but basically you got 70% of detection can be dealt with by having, again, a whistleblowing system, internal audit doing their job, and management doing their job. Very important. Okay. Let's just go past this. So what I'm going to do here, that's why I asked you to raise your hand before. I'm going to tell you what is the control, and I'd like you to raise your hand if you think it's preventive, or keep your hand down if you think it's detective. So just one more time, we've had a few more people join us since we last jumped on. So everyone, it doesn't matter if you're a recipient or not, or U.S. government or not, everyone raise your hand if you can. This is going to give us a framework So I'd like to see just take 10 seconds to find the raise your hand button so we know how many people are sort of participating in this. Okay, going up. Okay, you can see you raise your hands down there. I can't see what you see. It'll be probably in the chat function or where it identifies participants. Okay. Okay. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, thanks very much. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is I want you to raise your hand if you believe this activity is a preventive method, or keep your hand down if you think it's a detective. So screening people before you hire them, is that preventive? Raise your hand. Or if you think that's detective, lower your hand. Okay, so is that preventive or detective? Okay, great. We're almost getting up to 100 here. Okay, very good, very good. Excellent, put your hands down. Okay, the second one is bank reconciliations. Do you think bank reconciliations are preventive or detective? So again, put your hand up if you think bank reconciliations are preventive, or keep your hand down if you think they're detective. Okay. Preventive, hand up, detective down. Okay. So frequently we have closed circuit television recordings. The use of CCTV recordings, is that preventive, hand up, or detective, hand down? CCTV recordings. Okay. Okay, sort of passed out there. Okay, password, access rights to your machine. Is that preventive, hands up, or detective? Passwords. Okay. Certainly that's the highest correct score. Well done. Okay, asset verification. Again, does that prevent when we verify assets, or does that detect? Hands up for preventive, hands down for detective. Okay, very good. Hotline, whistleblowing. What do you think about hotlines? Are hotlines and whistleblowing, does that prevent it or detect it? Hands up if you think hotlines and whistleblowing prevents fraud, or if it's more after the fact detection. Okay, we're almost done here, but I think you're starting to see here that, and I see we're going to do have some good questions coming up as well, I believe. Okay, the final couple, auditing. Preventive if you think auditing prevents fraud, or hands down if it is detecting it. Okay, that's the most correct score so far. And segregation of duties. Okay, if we segregate responsibilities between people, will that prevent fraud or detect? Again, prevent, hands up. Okay, that's again quite high. Very good, very correct. Codes of conduct, preventive or detective? Hands up for preventive, down for, okay, so we had codes of conduct. Does that prevent fraud, or do we catch them after the fact? Codes of conduct. Okay. Okay, and finally, budget preparation. What do you think about that? Does proper budgeting prevent fraud, or does it detect it? Okay, all right, so I think you're starting to get the hang of it. So let's just go back. I think there's a lot of people, and a couple of these are very important to talk about. So of course, screening employees is preventive, and most of you got that correct. Again, if you have good employees, and you can assess whether they're, they may be in a position to, or again, looking at their history. We don't have time to explain them all, but bank reconciliations are after the fact. So that of course is detective. CCTV is always interesting. And when we have the full-blown course, we discuss this a lot. Essentially, when I said recordings, of course, that's after the fact. But many people say, well, certainly it's preventive as well, because if there's a camera there, they're not going to do it. And so you're both correct. I mean, either if you said preventive or detective, it's true. If you know you're going to get caught, that also will prevent. So that one sort of goes both ways. But the fact that it's recording, it may not stop someone because, they may not be, they're in a hoodie and they've got a getaway car and you're never going to catch them. Okay. So that generally though, it's detective. Okay. Password access rights. I think almost all of you got that correct. That is preventative. Okay. Asset verification, very much after the fact, detective. Hotlines, whistleblowers, generally after the fact, detective. But again, if you know the organization has a hotline and a whistleblower and it's effective. Last week, someone ripped something off and he or she got caught, that would prevent many people from doing it again. Okay, auditing is after the fact. Certainly segregation of duties is preventative. Preventive code of conduct is preventative, and budget preparation is preventative. Okay, having a good budget. Okay, so I think you get the thrust of what it is. So I'm going to go to Q&A here in a minute. Just going to get something out of the way here. Okay, so again, detection could be we say alarm systems, but when the alarm goes off, then someone is waking up and observing something like that. Okay, so but there's many ways to have it. The whole point is to understand what your risks are and put in place a reasonable, cost-effective way to prevent fraud. Okay, you can't prevent everything. And one of the rules on fraud prevention is you shouldn't have a control that's more expensive than the thing that could be stolen. The candy store owners could have policemen follow every student through to make sure nothing's stolen, but that control is more than the candy bars that are stolen. Okay, so it's just not a wise thing to do. It's not cost effective. Okay, so yeah, I mean, these are just your examples of detection, accounts, of course, management being involved in your accounts, approving invoices and cost change centers. Okay, again, I'm not going to read these to you, but again, especially, it's not all about money. Performance review. Okay, so this team was supposed to go out and do 100 male circumcisions a week, and they said they did 120, but where's the results? Or does that make sense? Could they do it during COVID? And so there's various ways to review again, prevention and detection. Okay, so here I want to talk about fraud detection methods, and I want to go straight to what they determined is because we're going to talk about how is occupational fraud detected, and the majority of the time it is tips. Who does it? I'm going to show you in the next slide. But as I said, tips or internal audit. And remember, it's their job to have proper controls in place. They're always looking to see whether the systems are working. They're testing. They're doing, every period, they're doing some sort of test on conflict of interest of reporting or payroll or procurement or travel. They're always seems like they're busy bothering someone, but they're just doing their job. Okay. And again, management review. Okay. Very infrequently is it going to be by the law enforcement's going to find out or that sort of thing. Certainly it's tips. Now, whose tips? The fraud detection method, this is quite telling here. Okay, employees, they report the fraud. So again, it's employees or the customer or anonymous, which normally would mean employee, customer, or the vendor. Do we have systems that enable our customers to tell about a fraud or a vendor? If a guy is honest and he says, look, your procurement guy tried to give me a bribe, or he asked for a bribe. And certainly in auditing, we have to go out and look at talk to vendors to see whether they were approached for fraud. But the whole point is you need a system for this, because most employees are honest and most employees hate when someone else is fraudulent. It's a bad environment. They don't want that environment. So if they have an environment that can report this, not just, this of course probably fall under whistleblowing, but again, bad. Let me ask you this. How many people, on here, how many people have a whistleblowing system? Hands up. Here we go. Quickly, there we go. Okay. Okay, so that's my base. How many people, how many organizations have a way of reporting positive things? Best employee, biggest giver, did the most for his or her associates. How many people recognize excellence versus just looking for negativity? Okay. It's less than half, okay? And I think that's what I'm saying. These things go hand in hand. Again, celebrate when people do the right thing. But the whole point, now we're talking about fraud, and this is when people do the wrong thing, but people reporting fraud are doing the right thing. Okay, so that's where that's especially important. If they feel good when they turn in a fraudster, and I'm not saying they get rewarded, okay, but the reward is in their, when they go home at night, they know they've done the right thing. Okay, but again, you want to make it possible for your customers. That's why frequently at checkout counters they say, if you didn't get a till slip, you get this meal for free. And so, of course, if they pay for something and didn't get the slip, and they see that, well, then they can call the manager over and say, wow, your guy didn't give me a receipt here, so I want my meal for free. So these are the easy controls to put in place. Let your vendors know. Let your vendors know, guys, if we run an honest system. Please let us know if you think someone, and you can also get feedback, not just of did we get ripped off, but were we courteous? Almost following up the ability of your staff to be good employees. Okay, I think we are going to have some queue here, so I'll go to our coordinator. Thank you, please.
Yes, please. I have several questions, but something relating to the detection and prevention. I'm seeing comments which are saying some of those steps can be both.
Correct.
Detective and preventative.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes.
So that's an example of, as I said, CCTV. Obviously I'm not a thief, but if I saw a camera up there, that would stop me. I mean, the bottom line is if I didn't care about that camera, because I'm going to be out the door and, into somewhere else and I'll never get caught. Okay. The police are incapable or whatever else. It doesn't matter if you're on camera, but then, later on, someone's going to look at the camera and say, look, we got broken into. Who's the guy? I don't know. We can't recognize him or her. Okay. So yeah, certainly it can be preventive and detective, correct?
Okay. Yeah, I have another question in French, but I will say it in English. It said in your presentation, you said in your presentation that not-for-profit associations can be more prone to fraud because of the limited resources available to them. In this specific case, what are the mechanisms to be implemented to prevent the fraud?
Well, again, it would depend on, NGOs tend to they have fewer controls, there's no doubt. And yeah, in this course, I don't have time to show you, but we do this all over Africa and elsewhere. But what you tend to have your auditing firms, you tend to have your NGOs, and you tend to have government, normally Ministry of Health people. And you can see when we check all this, you compare and contrast. And there's just, because NGOs, they don't have the money, they're project driven, and therefore, our HIV program is running out of money. We got the 5 years, but I'm going to do a TB program or a COVID program or something. So new objectives, new controls, maybe new people, turnover. It's just harder to have controls in place. But generally there may not be the same amount of assets to misappropriate in that sort of sense. So that's why I would say NGO frauds tend to be smaller, but they're still very prevalent. Okay.
All right. Another question is to do with fraud reporting. It says, suppose the fraud is reported wrongly and the investigation is not done accordingly. I think they want to say expectedly. And then the organization is punished wrongly, okay, and leading to being blacklisted. Yep. How do you go about this situation? How can it be corrected?
Okay, well, I mean, again, you start with the organization, management, or internal audit doing the assessment, and that's what I'm saying. I've never known USAID to try to hurt an organization that reported fraud, and later on they termed it wasn't fraud. Okay, we're working with one right now, and notified aid immediately. And we're getting to the point we're thinking, okay, what happened? And the client will report that, saying, okay, aid, this is what happened. Normally, organizations pay back the money if it was done with USAID money, and that's a normal thing. There was fraud, pay it back. Okay, that's never going to be an allowable cost. Okay, but again, did you fix the system? Did you control it? But more often than not, I don't think aid harms. They want good partners, and a partner who reports fraud and deals with it is probably a good partner. So I wouldn't be too concerned about reporting it, investigating it. If it turns out to be real, probably pay the money back if you can. Okay, but work with your agreement officer on that, and or again, prime or sub, depends on who you're going to work with. Keep the IG informed, and yeah, I wouldn't worry about unsubstantiated claims that turned out not to be fraud. Good question.
Yeah, and I think related to that is also a question here. It's talking about a fraud case that has been reported to police, and then the police, they release the suspect, and nothing more happens. And the question is, should the organizations find comfort in the fact that they have reported to USAID and the OIG? Would that be enough, even if the police have released, the suspects?
Yeah, I think that's pretty common, unfortunately, that the police are ineffective. I mean, certainly here in South Africa, things get stolen. The only reason you go to report it is to get a case number so you can claim your insurance. Is anyone going to go follow up? No. So yes, so employees steal 10 computers, you report it, no one follows up, but you still must notify USAID because they're going to want to know what happened, why did it happen, what controls can you put in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. Okay, so absolutely report it. AID doesn't have any more control over local police than you do, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
All right. The next question is, I think, similar to the other question on smaller organizations with the limited resources. It's talking about the adequacy of segregation of duties. Some functions are conducted by the same people all the time. So how can this be strengthened, to prevent the fraud from happening in smaller organizations?
Okay, sorry, read that again. We had some thunder clapping here one more time.
Oh, sorry. Please. Now, it's about smaller organizations who do not have enough personnel. And then they are saying that they have inadequate segregation of duties. So some functions are conducted by the same people. So how can this be strengthened in terms of fraud management? Okay, well, here it's important that as smaller organizations, management must be involved. And then frequently you can rotate responsibilities. It's important, frequently fraud takes place when people never go on holiday or vacation, because remember, the system works if they're there. Certainly if they're not there, some part of the fraud chain is broken. So yeah, I think there are ways to do it. Job rotation, management oversight, again, possibly internal audit or even outsource internal audit to come in every now and then, do spot checks, petty cash checks. Yeah, I think there are ways, but the bottom line for smaller organizations, if you have honest management, they should have their finger on the pulse more than a large organization that relies on systems. Okay, good question. Okay, all right. Yeah, and then another question about refunds. In case of proving that some expense was a fraud, and US requests the return of the amount that is not allowed, and knowing that the local partner has no own funds, which mechanisms can be put in place to make sure that the amount is paid back to USAID? Well, I mean, great question. I think I've been working with aid recipients for almost 40 years now. Rarely does the US government want to put an organization or NGO out of business. Okay, that's not their job. Their job is to give them money and they spend it well and we achieve development. Okay, but it does happen. Many NGOs literally only have USAID as their partner or a prime. Maybe we're having subrecipient. Well, we've already done subrecipient, but we'll hopefully do it again. But your funding may be okay. So that's part of the sustainability aspects. That's one of the 6 components of the pre-award survey. Is this organization only going to be relying on the U.S. government? Okay, that's why we can talk about cost share as well. Can they lay off any of this? But if there's no other money, then it's going to be a tough choice for that agreement officer to have to make. We had an organization that here in South Africa that went up Africa to do their project. They had there was fraud in that country, and it ended up that they only could work 2 or 3 days a week to pay the people. They had to keep it ticking over while they hopefully generated funds over the long term to be able to reimburse the government. But again, that would be a good organization or answer for an AO or CO
if there's any of those on the call and would wish to answer that. Okay, I can't speak on behalf of USAID. I just say rarely do they put an NGO out of business. Okay.
All right, great.
Just maybe a couple more so we can make sure we get through the time here. I'll stay on till midnight if there's questions, but I know many other people need to get on with it. Okay.
Okay, let me combine these two questions. It's about rewarding the whistleblowers. How can we protect whistleblowers and still reward them? But also, how can we manage, the relationships to avoid jeopardizing the relationships within teams? In other words, if somebody is rewarded for whistleblowing, and then how do the colleagues perceive, that kind of reward?
I'm not sure rewarding whistleblowing. I mean, again, there's a concept in the States called key tam, where whistleblowers do get a piece of the action. I'm not sure. I'm actually got that on my list to ask my friendly agreement officers. I'm not sure if that applies overseas, but again, if you're going to whistleblow and expect something for it, that's sort of a different system versus an ethical belief to do the right thing. So, I think your rewards by sleeping well and knowing you did the right thing. I can't think of any systems that I've worked at, any of our clients, where they actually pay people to do that. So I can't say that's common. So and it would be awful hard to do it anonymously, because all of a sudden the guy shows up with an extra money, and his or her lifestyle could be changed for, in theory, the right reason. So I'd say it's not common.
Okay. And now, finally, I think there's one question on the forms of fraud. One of the common forms of fraud these days is related to data. Can you address this as well? Can you make a comment on the data fraud?
Okay, if we're assuming data in terms of what people are reporting to USAID, yes, that happens. There's pressure on performance. As a matter of fact, recipients, the uniform guidance went into effect. It changed in August 13th, went into effect November 12th. Okay. The biggest changes, this is the 5-year update to the uniform guidance. The biggest changes in that had to do with performance. It wasn't financial management. There are some differences in NICRAs and 10% de minimis, but it's really about performance. So now every agency, not just USAID, is meant, when they design the program, they've got to design, what are the results going to be? And then in your performance section at 301 performance, 328, 329, a couple different places in the uniform guidance, there is now more expectation of performing and reporting. Okay, so certainly recipients with this interest in delivering, you should have a greater control over data quality, independent, not auditing per se. It would be more performance auditing, what the IG would do, not your statutory auditor, not your yellow book auditor. But yeah, you need a quality control person on when I think you mean data, on your results, M&E. Okay, so this is going to be, and that's part of this whole ASAP project, IntraHealth, ASAP, DAI, others. Okay, there's strong, and a lot of it is about performing non-US pre-award surveys. They look very hard at, are they going to be able to have the systems to report to what the US government demands and expects and deserves. Okay, maybe we carry on, and you're going to have some time at the end. That's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm seeing several hands raised up. If they are raised up from the previous session, please drop them down. But if you still have a question on that, you can post the question on the Q&A, and then we pick it up again in the next window. Yeah.
Okay, now this is part of a course we have, the Green Book, Internal Control for the U.S. government. It's of course not part of here, but I certainly recommend to our ASAP team to have even a baby version of the course, because really it will put what I've been saying here into perspective. And as I said, this COSO framework, that stands for Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, which is a massive exercise that done many years ago, when organizations were blowing up, more in the private sector. But if you've heard the term Sarbanes-Oxley, this is what it relates to. That same framework that works for, again, large global corporates works for our organizations, okay? And so it looks at efficiency and effectiveness of what we're doing, And of course, the reporting, which is so important, and then the compliance with the terms and conditions of your award. Okay, and that is basically, it's a requirement. And again, I'm not going to read the uniform guidance to you, but it applies both to USAID, which follows the 2 CFR 200, or our PEPFAR friends over on this Health and Human Services side. Okay, it just talks about internal controls. And that's what, again, this is the same stuff your auditors look for when they're doing your annual audit. Okay, we don't look at efficiency of operations, but certainly we do look at your internal control section and your compliance, which is the third report in your Yellow Book audit. Okay, so here's where it is, and there's 5 requirements in internal control. Okay, notice what it says: non-federal entity must. And recipients, if you do nothing else after this this webinar, and we did this in the financial management webinar, we explained that the use of the word must versus should is now much more stronger than it used to be. When the OMB created the new guidelines, they basically took the concept from the auditors and said, if it says must, this is auditable. And so I would have a compliance person who goes through your award, goes through all the standard provisions, identifies all the musts, and creates, like we talked about, that risk framework. You create a compliance framework, and I say, who's responsible for all of these musts? Because I can promise you, as an auditor, we're going to look for those musts and audit that. Okay. So the bottom line here, this says the non-federal entity must establish a system of internal controls, and then it goes on. Sorry, I'm going to use my highlighter again here because that went off. These controls should be in compliance with basically the U.S. government internal control framework, which I'm going to show you now. Okay, but it goes on to, there's 5 musts. You must comply with the statutes and regulations in your award. Your system must evaluate whether, not just must you be compliant, you must evaluate through your system whether you are compliant. So someone's got to look over your policies and procedures on a regular basis, okay? And again, NGOs say, I don't have the money for this. USA doesn't give me money for that. That's why I'm saying, when you do your budget, if you could say to your evaluation committee, look, you asked me before the pre-award survey, do I have organizations in place? Okay, and we're saying we think we're a bit weak. We need to beef up our whatever, procurement, travel, timekeeping, and I'm putting money in the budget. Okay, well, certainly, if they don't give you money in the budget and later on you fail, at least you could say, look, we identified this weakness up front. They may also give you what's called condition, special award conditions, to specifically say, strengthen this, this, and this. Okay, what do we need to do? We need to take prompt action when we find non-compliance, not just in fraud. This is when your auditors find you didn't do timekeeping correct, or you didn't have adequate procurement records. You've got to do something about it. That's what a control system does. It reacts to non-compliance. And then finally, this personally protected information, incredibly important these days. Many times our programs deal with HIV positive people, or people's sexual preferences, or voting, could be support for democracy and governance. Those are very important, very secretive things, or very, let's just say this, very sensitive. In many countries, there's still stigma for HIV. I mean, gay, lesbian rights is not popular around the world. So, being all for democracy and governance is not supported everywhere in the world. So you if nothing else, after this webinar, go back and ask your IT people, guys, what are we doing to protect the information of our participants, not just participants, but the people as part of our project? It's a must. Okay. So conceptually, and I'm going to move along here, conceptually, and this comes out of the GAO, that's the Government Accounting Office. Those are the guys who create the Yellow Book and the Green Book. Okay, and the concept is we identify our objectives. Okay, so what do we need? 10,000 people on care and treatment, 1,000 orphans, whatever else. So then we design controls over the drugs, the kids, their safety, whatever else. And then those controls are in place and they're working. There's a good chance you'll achieve your objective. But I put in the big caveat, possibly, okay? Because no one could have predicted COVID. No one could predict the next crisis to come along. But if the system is, if you know what you're trying to achieve, you design the system to work, the controls are in place, and then you have a good chance you will. Okay, the bottom line is, if you don't have this in place, if you don't design controls and put them in place, you will very likely, as we saw with the fraud triangle, you'll very likely have fraud and fail. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve, you're not going to achieve it. Okay, so very quickly here is, your structure is the board or leadership, and you frequently have these committees, and frequently the board should be made up of non-executive directors, preferably. Okay, and then we've got sort of your management, your CEO, CFO, COO, all the folks who basically are inside the organization and paid for by the organization. And then finally, 90% or more of the people are the staff who are driving the organization. Okay, and here we have sort of exploded. And the important thing I want to talk about here is, yes, you should have an organogram, and certainly when someone's doing your pre-award survey, they'll ask for it because it shows you understand how your organization is structured. But notice where internal audit sits. Internal audit is independent of the CEO. Notice the dotted line goes to the CEO. The straight line is going to the board. And that's why when we talk about whistleblowing and fraud, that's what we're talking about. Frequently, it's the internal audit group that is because they are independent. That's frequently where the whistleblowing or anything of an ethical nature, conflicts of interest, go to internal audit. Or you could have sitting outside, of course, a whistleblowing system that goes straight to the board. But I'm aware of organizations where the whistleblowers have sort of a two-tier. If the whistleblowing is about something down in the body of the organization, then they can report that to the CEO and possibly to the board as well. But the board doesn't have to be involved in every potential fraud. If there's something wrong with HR and the chief executive can't be part of it, it's between this guy and this guy, and there's a fraud, frequently that can be handled internally, and they'll start the investigation. And frequently internal audit will do the investigation. Okay, we don't have time, but this is the structure. This is the COSO framework. You'll notice down there it talks about the GAO. And it's just basically, it's like a Rubik's Cube on three planes. You've got the components here, where you've got basically the control environment that we talked about, where the leadership gets involved. We've got the risk assessment, where we have to determine our risks. Once we know our risk, we put in place the control activities. And then, of course, we monitor the information flowing through the organization. One of the last questions was data and that sort of stuff. Well, how do we make sure, we are going to assess that someone's going to send in bad data? What control activities do we put in place? And again, how do we use that information? Timely information on an internal and external basis. That's what's said about quality information on a timely basis to the right users. Okay. Then the categories objectives are, the operations, with meaning your efficiency and effectiveness. Again, the reporting, and reporting is very different for for-profits and not-for-profits. And then, of course, compliance for most implementing partners, massively important. All the provisions you must comply with. Okay, and this plane, if you will, is basically conceptual, taking it from the largest consideration of the entity to its smallest function. So this could be the US government as a whole, and this could be the various agencies, and then within the agencies, it could be, where our operating theaters, our Africa, our Asia, our Latin America, and so forth. But eventually it gets down to functions. And functions could be, HR, IT, specific projects, things like that. Okay. And all I want to say is basically each of these little cubes would have a different risk profile. Okay, we don't have the time to talk about it now, but we give the example of Barings Bank was brought down by one individual, and that was Nick Leeson. Nick Leeson, he was the original rogue trader. Okay, so he sat in a basement somewhere with his computer, and over the course of months, bankrupted the Barings Bank, and over $1.2 billion. So, it didn't matter that the bank was clean and the tellers were nice and the money counted every night. Somewhere back, there was a missing control activity and a function of, the treasury function and the operations. So you can imagine, on these planes, there was no control activities of a function of an operational nature. So that, that part of the cube didn't work. And all it takes is one piece of the cube to fail, and it could be curtains. Okay, it's all about judgment. Okay, and people are certainly under pressure, but that's why it's so important. You can't. It's going to take management judgment of who to hire. It's going to take the internal audit judgment where to look. It's going to take the risk assessment judgment of where we think our risks are. It's a team effort, and again. The IG, whenever you ask them information about some of this stuff, he always says, it's your judgment. It's the auditor's judgment. Okay, I'm just going to be cognizant of the time here. So things do break down. Okay, people make mistakes. And so, you can't always blame people. Frequently, people get defrauded. They feel so horrible after the fact. They say, I didn't know, this guy asked me for my password. Next thing you know, we were hacked. Okay, so again, communication is incredibly important. I'm just going to leave this at that. Again, you want things that are preventive, and detective. Okay, collusion. Okay, internal control. Okay, we've got the webinar. We've got the question going up. So please answer the poll when you get a chance. It will be up for a while. I'm going to carry on. Okay, so collusion, as we said, where two or more people override a system. And this is impossible to plan for, okay? Because you set up systems with segregation of duties, but especially if management colludes, then that's where the biggest frauds are. The Bernie Madoffs, the blow-ups in the bank, Lehman Brothers, Waste, what was it? Waste Incorporated. All the big blow-ups are not people stealing stuff. It is management in cahoots with their auditors or themselves or their board. Okay, so collusion is very difficult. And that's why I say, I'll show you here where, again, you can get the survey and read these yourself. I think it's fascinating. Okay, I'm cognizant there are going to be some more questions. So again, collusion, how many people perpetrate? So 90,000. Now this is not in NGO, this is in general fraud, not specifically in not-for-profits or small organizations, okay? But again, one guy, normally that's theft, two, bigger, three, management, and it's going to be a bigger sort of loss because just, if you need more than one people to perpetrate a fraud, it's going to be probably for more money. Okay, so the same thing, management override, the same concept. It's difficult to detect because management can hide stuff. They can sign stuff after the fact. They have access to records that wouldn't, normally be in the normal chain of control of people locking things, and they may have access to blank forms that can be filled out later. And again, hopefully you trust management. So if they're untrustworthy and don't walk the talk, then you're going to have some serious frauds. Okay, again, management override. It sort of relates to the other one. So employee perpetrating occupational fraud is the majority, but they're small. Again, management getting involved, they're bigger, and there's more, but the numbers are bigger as well. And then again, owner fraud is massive there. Okay, so again, I think you get the concept. I don't want to necessarily read the slides to you, but when management gets involved in fraud, it tends to be big. Okay, so what can we do? How do we prevent it? Again, we need proper systems. I'm going to get through this to get to whistleblowing. Okay, and just again, why perform investigations? I mean, someone asked later, again, to make sure you have the facts that something did get wrong, and consider if you should take action against those who perpetrated a fraud. Absolutely. I think you should have a no fraud policy. Many NGOs, if there's fraud, they're out. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter if it's a CEO's assistant. Doesn't matter if it's anyone fraud. You set a good precedent, fire the person. That speaks volumes. Okay, again, you might need to quantify the loss or again, take it to the police or that sort of thing. But most importantly, you identify how it happened. That's why we investigate. And as we say, take it to the police if you have to, certainly notify USAID. Okay, so again, sharing information and communicating, this has to do with good systems. I want to get to whistleblowing, okay? So we can come back to these if we have time. I see we have a number of questions and I'm happy to stay on as long as you want. So this is a requirement in your USAID standard provision. And again, Health and Human Services, your notice of award, same thing. You must, that's a big must. Okay, you must notify your employees, and if they don't speak English, you must notify them in their predominant language that they have rights, whistleblowing rights. Okay, and also that's got to go into your subawards and subcontracts. What are those rights? The right is that they cannot be, they have to know in their language, they can't be discharged or fired or demoted or discriminated against for whistleblowing. And again, earlier you asked the question, what if they are? Well, that's the importance of having a system that's set up so they can't be necessarily, or at least the system's not going to identify them. Okay, as you said, in a small organization, everyone knows everyone else's business, and it may not be possible to avoid knowing who did it, but the system should try to. They have to realize that they, as an employee, are not the organization is not going to discharge the smoke then. Okay? They can't be waived by agreement. That's why I said before, you can't have, oh, I promise not to tell. That's another mandatory standard provision, I think 25 that we looked at. Okay, but what is it? It's not absolute, it's not being sure. Whistleblowing is the employee has reasonable belief that something happened. They don't have to be perfectly know it. As I said, we followed up one that had 13 assertions. Well, 3 were true, 3, but the other 10 weren't. They just had it wrong, had bad information, saw the wrong thing, didn't understand, what was supposed to be in place. But still, for those 3, that was they reported 13. Well, 3 were, and it was followed up. So again, they're notified, they're protected, but they have to have reasonable belief that something is. And these, they're all big. Gross mismanagement, gross waste of federal funds, abuse of authority. Now, abuse is where one uses their position of authority to personally profit and to or to help others, family members or someone else. Okay, so abuse abuse isn't always financial. You could use your abuse. You could be the HR person and you hire your friends, cousins, whatever else, someone from your church, someone from your sports club. That's abuse of authority. Now, the organization needed an employee, but you abuse your authority to put possibly the wrong person in there. So it's funny, it doesn't say gross abuse. And I'm needing to talk to the IG folks about, it sounds to me like abuse in itself is gross, is deemed significant, okay? Substantial specific danger. So what are you doing with the leftover drugs, the needles, the blood? What are you doing with the nets that were sprayed for pesticides? Okay, what are you doing with all this stuff? Are you throwing it down the drain? Are you putting it in the dump? Or are you spending the extra X dollars a month to put it in those cute little yellow containers and someone comes and takes it away? Okay, that's important. People could die if they get pricked by an HIV positive thing. So just be careful. And then finally, it's the normal sort of stuff related to competition or negotiation. So most people think whistleblowing is all about, people buying stuff or selling stuff or procurement. Not necessarily, it could be many things. Then finally, you have to notify someone. So again, you've got reasonable belief that something significant was wrong. Most of these, no one would ever deal with it. Member of Congress, you are not going to, most people across the world don't know a congressman or woman and wouldn't know who to report to. Inspector General, yes, they've got a whistleblowing number. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be in English, and it is, when they work, but I'm sure they have answering machines. Okay, GAO, unlikely. Now here we get a little bit more close. A federal employee responsible for the grant oversight. How about your AO? How about your AOR? Maybe even the controller, okay? They're responsible, I would say ultimately it's your agreement officer who is responsible for that, but that may be delegated or designated down to the AOR in the designation letter, okay? Grand Quarter Jury, no. Finally, the person in your organization who's responsible for this. Who's responsible? Is it at the board level? And do the employees know that? Do they know problems? Go to internal audit. Do they know where their whistleblowing is going to go through? All of that needs to be explicitly clear so no one is fearful to use the system. Okay, so I believe it's very important, a transparent system that works and that someone reports. And here's the problem. Someone reports and it's unvalidated. You can't, and they don't give their number. Frequently, we have situations where it might be true, but we don't know who the person is. And so we can't get back to them to say, can you, when did it happen? What happened? Can you give us an invoice? Can you give us a date? Can you give us anything more? We're not going to expose you to investigate it. We have to know more, but they feel the system's not working. That's why it's very clear. It's very important to communicate if the system works, if you give us enough information or some possible way to safely contact you. Maybe it's not your cell phone. Maybe it's a big thing. Buy a second cell phone. Buy an extra SIM card. And it's worth it. And I would think, if you spend $50 or $100 to whistleblow on someone, the NGO might reimburse you. But it's not about making money. It's just about having a way to communicate. Okay, we're almost done here. So how do people whistleblow? Well, it has changed over time, but it's almost all coagulating about 33% through a hotline, telephone, through email systems, or now on the web. People having web-based systems. So that's the majority. So there could be multiple ways recipients to have people report their frauds, because someone may not be happy with an email. And again, but it doesn't have to be from your email address. You could go to an email cafe or a cafe and send emails. Again, telephone hotlines. Again, they're normally monitored, not necessarily by the management. Most of the ones, at least here in Southern Africa, are done by accounting firms or external people, and they also don't say who did it, he or she or anything. It wasn't like, oh, it was a young guy. It sounded like they're in HR. No, they totally sanitize it, and management or whoever only learns what they need to learn. Okay, so there could be many ways to do that. And so here's the final one. I think this is the final one. Okay, so this one is about who do people whistleblow to? Okay, and many of these are, I'm not saying they're wrong, but they're ineffective. Okay, if you report to your direct supervisor, that is probably not going to be effective, because first of all, you are now certainly not, you are not necessarily anonymous. Okay, and he or she may, again, if you're exposing something that your supervisor is worried about, later on it says, well, that guy in your department caused whistle blew, that could not be good. That may not be good for you. So that's probably not a great idea, supervisor. And again, so organizations have to have in place to not have it be just tell your boss about this, because your boss could be the one. I told you about the organization where their fraud was that the chief of party was part of it, and the M&E person. Well, of course, if you're going to have the chief of party and the M&E colluding, you're going to have some fictitious results. Okay, fraud investigation team. I think that's a good idea. Okay, that they should be independent. Internal audit, normally a good idea. The executive, possibly, but preferably the non-executive directors. Okay, when I say executive or non-executive, the difference is the executive people work in the organization. The non-execs normally sit on the board and are independent. The reason they're brought in is because they're independent. Okay, co-workers, again, probably not going to go too far. Law enforcement, maybe. Owner, if it's a small organization, again, it could be the owner or the driver of your NGO. Certainly, if he or she cares about it, they wouldn't have created an NGO for it to be, fraudulent stuff to happen under them normally. Okay, and then finally, I'm just going to say that the board or the audit committee, that's always a safe one. Their job is to be there for things like this. Okay. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Again, if you just send me an email, I'm happy to send you those reports, or I could certainly make it available to ASAP as well, and they could put them on their website. But everyone doesn't always go to the website. And so with that, I just want to take the final questions and answers from our facilitator. What questions do we have, please? Every question is a good question. You can ask questions anonymously. Okay, so you got to put the Q&A in the Q&A chat. As we said earlier, it doesn't work. And raising your hand, if you put a Q&A, I think it would be possible for someone to probably unmute you if there's comments maybe from either mission people or IG if anyone's involved. But sir, we're all happy for conversation. Please. Okay, I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Oh, Doug. Yeah, I'm here.
Cool.
Yeah. I have one quick question. Probably you can answer that.
Sure.
How do you effectively conduct a lifestyle audit without causing conflict within the organization or staff feeling victimized? Okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not okay. It could go from anything as far as of understanding what clothes they wear, what car they're driving. And again, it can become intrusive if you're asking people to lifestyle audit to show you your bank accounts and that, but many times that is what it is. And again, if you are, so the management of, so again, we're in South Africa here, and there's been some challenges with the power company, Eskom, and they put all of their management and leadership through lifestyle audit. Say, okay, show us your bank accounts, what do you own? And of course, if you're going to be fraudulent, you might not be honest, but if you in organizations could say we have the right to perform lifestyle audits on you, So again, if I knew that going into an organization, knowing that every quarter or every year or something, I could be asked to provide my any assets I have, provide my bank statements, that sort of stuff. Again, certainly where the salary goes in, that would be one bank account. So someone could be fraudulent knowing they're going to have lifestyle audits, but a lot of times you're just asking people, all of a sudden someone doesn't show up for work anymore, is not on a timely basis. Normally if someone is, not that they're fraudulent, because normally fraudulent people are a bit sneaky anyways. But yeah, you could possibly notice differences in that person's behavior or, sort of, as I say, lifestyle. But there's no checklist of exactly what to look for. But I've never actually looked for it. I'm sure there are checklists. Probably ask your audit firm, or the IG may even have one. Ask Rig I. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, I saw several hands up. I'm still not sure whether these hands are for the questions. There are 10 of them. Do we have time for these, Doug?
Okay. I've got as much time as you want. I'm waiting here for you, so it's fine. Keep asking questions.
All right. Let me check. Okay, I've got Jacob. Jacob, if you're there.
I think you can unmute the people if you want.
Yes, I am doing that. Okay. Okay. Right.
I just want to get Doc's email address so that I can email him privately so that he can send the training materials.
Great. Okay, I'll put that up again. I just want to, we're ending it. Before I want to thank USAID. I want to thank IntraHealth and the ASAP team for making this available to you. Catherine and her team have many of these. I think they're fantastic. The French one is next Wednesday. Okay, and as Catherine said, tomorrow I think is one on, I think, gender-based violence. So certainly having worked with the US government for almost 40 years, I've never seen, and I'm honest with this, I've never seen an opportunity where USAID wants people to be successful. And so remember, ASAP is all about, as it says, accelerating support for local partners. They're doing it through this program. So please, obviously this will be uploaded and share it with your friends, and keep an eye open for future webinars. But there's a lot of old ones. We've already done mandatory standard provisions. We've done the cost principles. We've done subrecipient management. And yeah, a lot of good value, a lot of expenditure reporting, and other ones that are not all financial. So please take advantage of this program. Okay, sorry. I'll put that up now.
All right.
Next one.
Thank you. As you are putting that up, I have another question, a hand raised from Zwali.
Okay.
Zwali, can you proceed with your question? Okay, Zwali, are you there? All right. I can't hear Zwali. Okay. Mabusetsa, I can see your hand is up.
Okay. Well, do you have any more to read while people are
yeah. Okay. Let me go back to the questions, probably in the Q&A. There is a comment that's talking about organizations which are set up by founders.
Okay.
They tend to have board members who are selected by the founders.
Yeah.
Now, the challenge most of these is that they fail to report on fraud because of this lack of independence.
Absolutely, very true. That's unfortunate. Yeah. I mean, there's organizations. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yes, question.
No, so I was just asking, what's your opinion? How do you think this can be handled?
Yeah, well, that happens when what it does is takes maturity in the organization to serve as a good board member and to properly do your job. So frequently, someone is driven to save this, or to manage 1 million orphans or whatever else. They're driven, and so therefore, of course, their friends will say, "Yeah, I like what you're doing." And no one, I mean, many times sitting on a board is you don't get paid for it. Okay, in many countries, it's expected to do that for pro bono. So, I mean, I was the chairman of a large U.S. aid organization for a couple of years, and I didn't expect to get paid. But the bottom line is you must be independent. And so what tends to happen is initially that person who's driving it will get his or her friends. But eventually, that's the whole point about good governance, and especially these days, you've heard about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. That's the new sort of buzzword in what people are looking for in boards. A good board will start standing up for what they believe is the correct thing. And again, certainly early on in NGO, the owner or the creator will naturally surround themselves with yes people, but eventually they should grow out of it. Okay, that's a very true observation.
Yeah. Okay.
I
have another one here. Says a friend of mine reported on a case of abuse, but was not able to follow up with the process because they told him that the process was confidential, including the outcome. So the question says, but here you mentioned that the process should be told. So how do we balance these two positions?
Okay, so abuse, well, first of all, it is reportable to the US government. So I'm assuming this person's probably a US government on a US aid project. Okay, so abuse is one of those things that needs to go to the agreement officer. So, I mean, at the sub level, okay, I mean, let's just say this, it has to go to the IG in Washington, okay? Now, the IG in Washington doesn't have unlimited budget to look at every case of abuse. They've got limited budgets as well. So they might send it down to the RIG, and we've got a great RIG here, Regional Inspector General, or, OIG for Africa Regional Office, it's now called. We've got a great group down here who's responsible for all across Africa. I'm sure if they were given the authority to look at it, they would. So I would think if someone's told you're not going to hear about it. Now, again, I wouldn't expect you to hear about it, but if you have legitimately said or know that someone has done something, certifiably wrong, that person should be addressed with. Okay, it should be dealt with. And if he or she is still there 2 months later and you're sure it was abuse, I would follow up with try a different way. Go again directly to your board. Go direct. I don't know how they reported it, but I would try a different channel. I mean, just possibly. Rarely would the board, or certainly not the audit committee chairperson, she or he would be independent. Okay, or go to that organization's external auditors. Okay, try different channels to say I did this, and again, possibly have a way to follow up that they can get back in touch with you, which again exposes you possibly to exposure. But yeah, I think the board and audit chair would be people who would respect your anonymity, as well as possibly saying, look, I reported that, not just report what the abuse was, report that you reported the abuse and what you were told. You're told you're not going to ever find out. Now, again, if a second person tells you, well, we're not going to tell it because it is whatever, again, I don't think the audit chair would be lying to you. That's just not their job. Okay, good question.
Okay. Yeah, let me go back to the hands that are up. I still have a hand up from Jacob.
Guys, if you want, it can be unmuted and.
Yeah.
Okay, so Damiano, you're going to be doing the French version of this, correct?
Yes, on the 3rd of March.
Okay, so I mean, hopefully, I know many people. I mean, I saw a lot of names who were going through were certainly West African based, you could see. So hopefully those folks who are on here can get it again in French, or also notify your associates. There's no cost to this webinar. I think it again, get your questions answered. Think of more questions, and I don't, yeah, for English speaking people to attend the French version, that would not be very useful. But what happens is, again, Damiano is going to handle the Q&A in French, and the content, these slides will all be translated into French. by a guy named Desiree, who's a fantastic presenter, and he just had a baby. He'd have been here today as well.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a hand from Andrew Cohen. Andrew Cohen, you're already unmuted, so you can speak.
Andrew, if you're on mute, we can't hear you.
Okay, we can't hear from Andrew. We have Victor. Victor, are you available? You have raised your hand. I think all these ones that are raised, they seem not to be there.
Might just be leftovers.
Yeah,
Okay,
I don't have questions also in the inbox. Yep.
Okay, well, thank you for coordinating. It was very well. And again, thank the IntraHealth team. And again, the whole consortium, and especially USAID for making these opportunities available. So with that, I will turn it over to you or Catherine or Jeffrey or anyone else. I do have, we're at 2 hours, which is the normal time if there's no extra questions.
Yeah, Catherine is not here, I think.
Okay.
She's attending to other issues, but I just want to thank everybody who attended the webinar today. This has been very useful, and thanks so much for the many questions that you posed. This will be shared, and we're hoping that you're going to make good use of it. Those who want to attend the French session, be ready on the 3rd of March. That will be there, and also be on the lookout for other webinars that are coming in the months to come. So thank you, everybody, and keep working. Let's keep in touch.
Okay, stay safe with COVID. Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.